You're listening to the Ask Drone U podcast. You ask, we answer your drone questions. Whether you're here to turn your passion into profit or you simply fly for fun, we're a community of learners and teachers who aspire to achieve greatness. We are
Drone U.
Welcome everyone. I'm Brendan Schulman, Vice President of Policy and Legal Affairs at DJI, and welcome to our session on the latest policy developments concerning UAS. I thought that was a terrific morning of stories of innovation and technology working together to improve the world, really. And if you think back to just barely 2 years ago, there were no rules for commercial operations. So all the things we saw this morning really have been enabled by the regulatory framework that now exists and that the FAA put into place a little more than 2 years ago. And from my point of view, that's really the importance of policy and regulatory work that we do. We now, you may not know this, we now have a team of 9 people, 9 professionals in the policy space worldwide. And really, we're working for you. We're on your team, advocating so that all of you can fly more places, have easier access to the technology, and live under a reasonable set of rules and requirements. And I'm really glad to say we have an amazingly distinguished panel here today to bring you perspectives on the latest on what's going on in Washington and at the state and local level. I'm just going to very briefly introduce them. These are abbreviated bios. They're very distinguished. You should certainly feel free to peruse the fuller bio in the program. So first of all, Danielle Corbett from the FAA is an aviation safety inspector in the FAA's UAS Integration Office, where she works on the development and implementation of programs, regulations, policy, and guidance for UAS. She has over 15 years of professional aviation experience flying business jets and seaplanes, and is an airline transport pilot, certified flight instructor, and holds a remote pilot certificate. Next to her, we have Brian Wynn, who's the president and CEO of the Association for Unmanned Vehicle Systems International, also known as AUVSI, which is the world's largest nonprofit organization dedicated to the advancement of unmanned systems and robotics. Next to Brian, Diana Cooper is the Senior Vice President of Policy and Strategy at Precision Hawk. Prior to joining Precision Hawk, Diana, sort of like me, if you guys remember my earlier years, led a UAS practice group at a leading law firm. She serves on various UAS industry and advocacy advisory boards, has testified on UAS policy before the Senate Commerce Committee, briefed the House UAS caucus on issues affecting the drone industry, and participated in White House meetings on UAS. Next to Diana, Jazz Banga, who has the coolest name on the panel. Jazz is CEO and co-founder of Airspace Systems, which is a Silicon Valley-based company leading the development of aerial security systems for enterprise. Airspace uses AI and advanced robotics to create fully automated, always-on solutions that deliver long-range detection, instant ID, dependable capture, and safe removal of unauthorized or malicious drones. A little bit of an interesting angle, I think, today from the counter-UAS space. It's probably not the term we prefer, but maybe we think of it that way. And last but certainly not least, Andrew Elephant from Kitty Hawk. He's the Director of Policy at Kitty Hawk, an enterprise drone operations and management platform backed by Boeing. Andrew's a licensed attorney in California, so we've got 3 attorneys up here. And he holds a commercial drone pilot certificate and a private pilot certificate with instrument and multi-engine ratings. So I think we've got 3 lawyers, a number of pilots, and all of us experts on the latest and greatest coming out of the policy world on UAS. What I want to do is sort of do a very quick, broad scope of some of the most exciting or challenging issues that we're facing in the policy world. So I'm just going to ask the panel, sort of open-ended, very quick, what's the most, if there's one most exciting upcoming UAS policy development, what would that be? Jazz, do you have an idea?
I think not being scared of going to jail for shooting down drones is a really good thing. It helps a lot with getting investors and more people on the team.
Cool. And what's the most challenging UAS policy development? In other words, what's going to be the hardest thing for policymakers to get right?
Well, state and local concerns that have really led to some terrible proposals on the Hill over the last couple of years that we valiantly fought off successfully and are now dealing with in other areas like the Uniform Law Commission, has been one of the most troubling threats to the industry over the last couple of years, and I think we'll get into that a bit more soon.
Yeah, we're going to hit all these things in depth. What about the most beneficial upcoming policy development to operators?
I think the most beneficial will be the building of the UTM, and I think what I mean by that really is more automation on our side and the FAA side. You guys are doing all the automation of the systems, and we're starting to automate our processes.
Is there a policy issue that will solve the biggest problems?
Well, I'll say remote identification is certainly the thing that we can do that will solve the most number of problems we have right now. I think getting that in will alleviate a lot of the concerns that are out there.
Great, and finally, what's the issue you're most worried about in the policy world? Want to have Andrew?
Yeah, I think one thing that I'm concerned about is overreaction to unforeseen events. I think we've seen a lot of very measured, careful progress over the last couple of years, and I think something that unforeseen could definitely be a challenge to manage that reaction.
Great, so we're going to do a deeper dive on many, if not all, of these issues. And I wanted to start with, I think, the most significant recent development in the policy world, and that's the FAA Reauthorization Act, signed into law earlier this month, really a culmination of a lot of work by Congress and industry. And I want to sort of pose that to Danielle from the FAA perspective. What is the FAA Reauthorization Bill? Why is it important? What does it do for you and the industry?
I think at first glance, it's really a testament to the collaboration. That's a word that's been used a lot this morning. The FAA has had with the industry and with Congress. And so we're seeing it as a very good thing. It's got a lot of enabling provisions in it for operations, and it also addresses a lot of the security concerns. Practically speaking, it's great. It gives us 5 more years of spending, which gives us flexibility in how we're doing that. When you take a look at what it covers a lot of stuff that we're already working on, which is good news in that we're moving in the right direction, and that we already have a head start on getting a lot of those initiatives off the ground. And it reaffirms our implementation plan. I do have a slide that kind of shows this plan that we've been showing for a number of years that shows all the regulatory hurdles. And the reauthorization touches on a lot of them. For an example, it reaffirms the integration pilot program, and it talks about giving us authorities for using voluntary consensus standards and performance-based regulations. That also speaks to the collaboration that the FAA has with the industry, which is really important. One of the largest provisions in the reauthorization is the repeal of Section 336, which was the special rule for model aircraft, and that's been replaced by a new rule called Section 349, which is a very good thing. It puts all UAS operators on the same page with regard to airspace access. And when everybody's on the same page, then we're able to more quickly assess risk and enable more complex operations. So I think that's a good thing for everyone. And it also affirms our ability to use our existing authorities to enable operations now. So we're doing all of these things at the same time. So rather than looking at this as a linear line towards some final end, we're able to kind of mix and match now to try to get you guys up and running. And as far as security goes, I know we're going to touch on this a little later, one of the biggest things is the counter-UAS authorities for DHS and DOJ, which there's been a lot of news about recently, and we'll, I'm surely touch on that a little bit.
Great, thank you. So from the leader of the largest UAS industry organization, Brian, what's your perspective on the bill and its importance to commercial operators, to the people who attended Airworks?
Well, looking at this, I'm really glad I don't work for the FAA. I'm really glad that Danielle is here because I think at last count there are like 240 things that need to be done in response to Congress, I think in the first 6 months. And she's laughing, but she's laughing mirthlessly. And I think that always happens. That, you know, we're only going to do this once in 5 years, which is a blessing that hasn't been done in decades, that the FAA has been authorized for that long. So that's a really, really good thing. But Congress, of course, wants to direct how the money is being utilized. And Congress really, in some ways, is the last place in the world you want trying to figure out the sequence of what needs to be done. And we've seen that even industry and the FAA working together sometimes don't get things in the right sequence. Remote identification, flight over people, you know, that was a classic example of we needed remote ID before we could do flight over people, according to the security agencies. The good news is we've now got it kind of, the dam is broken. That's a lot of work for you guys and for industry in collaboration. But I think, you know, we were something as simple as, as 336 being resolved, and I know that too requires additional work, but that was almost becoming a huge barrier to moving things forward. And now it's really a question of making sure that we do this efficiently, efficaciously, if I could use that word, and in the right sequence.
Great. Diana, your company runs a very large drone pilot network. Anything in the bill stand out to you as being particularly helpful to your operators?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the bill hits so many high notes for industry as a whole, but you know, what we're really excited about as a company is the changes emergency operations provisions that allow civil operators to access the ECOA system and allow them to use that even after the hurricane or the event is over. But you know, there are still reconstruction efforts, including insurance claims processing efforts. If you're a homeowner, you can imagine the emergency is still going on a few months later if your claim has not been processed. So we champion those changes to the law, how it treats emergency operations in terms of who qualifies for those authorizations as well as the types of circumstances.
Jazz, there's a counter UAS provision in the bill. Oh, don't look at that. We're gonna learn.
We get to have all the fun. You guys get to write all the rules, I guess.
So tell us, what is the role of the counter UAS solution to the enterprise community, and should we be afraid of you shooting our drones down?
Well, absolutely not. I think that one of the reasons why we participate in these kinds of events is that we're pro UAS. We're pro. I was a modeler for many years before this, so I think what this is going to do is it's going to provide a security system and allow, in this case, the federal authorities. We just recently protected the World Series. Couldn't talk about it until now, but when you think about a game like that, that's your friends and family and games, and a lot of armed services are there, and they need to be protected from these careless, clueless operators, right? And some of the really bad folks. So I think what it'll do is it gives federal folks authority to start thinking about how they're going to react as a last resort. Like, I think shooting down a drone, while it's fun, it is the last thing you want to do. And even in the case of the World Series, we had many drones flying in Boston and in Los Angeles, and the natural thing to do is to try and find the operator to talk them down. But if that doesn't work or you can't find them, then you need some sort of tool to be able to bring it down. So that's what we focus on, is really the capability. But what's happening is the three sections in this space: detection, ID, and then mitigation are going to be, it's going to be in that order. You're going to detect first, you're going to identify whether or not it's a blue force, whether it's an officer or somebody else conducting a mission that should be interrupted, and then as a last resort, you'll intercept. And that's what we're focused on, is that capability and the chain.
So let me go back to the operator for a second. Diana, your company's got drones flying, doing all kinds of services and operations. How do you feel about the counter UAS authority? Who should be able to take down the drone or at least do something to it? Certainly, I agree, protection of critical sites and events is important, but how do we balance that? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're very supportive of extending counter UAS measures authority to DHS and DOJ. What we would like to make sure that we see is, the devil's going to be in the details, and we like to have a role for industry to participate alongside the security partners to work out the framework in terms of implementing those authorities. And as a company that develops a long-term UTM system, we have technology concerns about, if the law enforcement intercepts the UTM network, we don't want to have, unintended consequences for other drones operating on that same network. So what we're really looking forward to is a partnership among industry and the security partners make sure the right privacy as well as security and safety implications are moving forward with this framework.
If I could add something to that, really the way to look at all these counter UAS systems is to think of them as access control systems. So think of the HID card you have to get into your office. 99% of the time, it's to enable people to use that airspace, or in that case, walk through a door. And then the other percentage of the time, it stops them from getting in. So I think the counter UAS, when it's used right, will stop the bad ones, but allow the good missions through. Our job is to scale operations, not slow them down.
So Brian, how does the broader UAS community embrace or interact with the counter UAS solutions? Certainly there's an incentive, I think, obvious incentive to create fear and concern about drones in order to sell solutions. At the same time, clearly there's a role for solutions in places where they're needed. How do we navigate that in partnership with that part of the industry?
I don't think it's a different part of the industry. I think it's all part of the same industry. I mean, like you said, Jazz, it's you don't expose a computer to the internet without antivirus software. We have firewalls for our networks. The key here is we have to get to scale. If we're going to get to scale, we're going to darken the sky with drones. We need to give folks the tools that they need to pick out the ones that are not participating in the system, and the ability and the authority to actually address those things in very, very short order. That requires a very mature conversation. I think the conversation is getting more mature. I think where it's challenging is when folks go out and try and sell solutions, with the quote worst case scenarios. Jazz knows better than this. We've talked about it a lot, but there is some of that going on out there, and it stokes the fears. There's legitimate fears, and as an organization, as a community, we need to be addressing those in a very mature way. So I don't view it as us versus them. I view this as part of a complete solution.
So the bill provides authority to 2 federal agencies to basically counter or mitigate UAS threats in specific locations or events. Just going to Andrew for a second, I know you've written about state and local authority to regulate or otherwise interact with drones. Any thoughts on how we move from federal agencies to local agencies that might need to do a counter or mitigation type of operation?
I think that's an interesting scenario. I mean, I think that while we talk a lot about how the federal level these rules and regulations are important, it's also important to keep in mind that the people who are going to be interacting with the pilots on the ground are going to be local officials. So I think that brings up an interesting interplay between kind of those who make rules and those who enforce the rules.
Great. So another major policy issue that we already highlighted is the issue of state and local authority to regulate UAS, particularly at low altitudes, and that's been the topic of much discussion and work over the past little while. And I think you touched on that at the beginning. Could you tell us, just maybe for those who aren't following policy issues as closely as all of us, sort of what proposals were out there over the past year, where things have sort of come and gone, and where we ended up in this bill?
Sure, absolutely. So just by way of background, over the last few years, although the FAA has authority over aerospace regulation down to the ground, many states, pretty much every state, as well as various cities and counties have enacted bills seeking to regulate drones from a variety of perspectives, from critical infrastructure protection, privacy, as well as some attempts at safety regulation as well. Over the last year or so, we've seen Senator Feinstein as well as Congressman Lewis introduce proposals in Congress that were seeking to give authority to states and locals to regulate up to 200 feet, which, as you can imagine, if they banned operations up to 200 feet, how are you going to get to between 200 and 400 feet, which is where you're allowed to fly? We obviously were very concerned about the proposals. I think it was a very interesting, academic proposal that someone came up with in a university somewhere, but not something that would work very well in terms of safety or innovation. And so, the last thing we wanted to see was 36,000 counties across the United States with no experience regulating aviation, suddenly creating their own rules and their own patchwork for the industry. So many of us here fought that battle very successfully together on the Hill, and what the outcome was just a simple codification of the drone integration pilot program that President Trump directed DOT and the FAA to stand up over the last year. And that really creates the perfect testing ground for our industry to work in partnership with state and local entities to promote beneficial operations in their local communities and get people comfortable with the technology and solicit input, as opposed to taking away the FAA's regulatory authority and granting that at the local level.
Now, before I ask the FAA for an update on the IPP, which is certainly connected to this issue, let me ask Brian. You penned an op-ed last week whose title was "The Biggest Threat to Drone Innovation is a Group You've Never Heard of." Can you tell us? I think we should hear what that group is and what you're talking about and where things stand.
Yeah, I did that with Gary Shapiro, the head of the Consumer Technology Association. The group is called the Uniform Legal Counsel Legal Commission, and ULC is they're a bunch of very, I think, well-meaning lawyers. Sorry, I'm up here with lawyers, so I was going to say that's not.
We all mean well. We don't always.
I came very close to law school. Well-meaning lawyers that provide model legislation to state legislators, and so this was a great opportunity, and unfortunately, it sort of took a hard left turn on us. And they really seem to, for a couple of rounds here, have a very tin ear about what the implications of this were, and I think it was kind of going in a direction. Over the weekend, the skies opened, the lights started to shine in, and they started to sort of back up to some basic legal principles of you really don't have a claim of some sort of if you can't demonstrate harm, then you can't prevent people from doing certain things. So that's a ray of hope. We worked really hard to get that message out there. They were getting that message not just from industry, they were getting that message from the FAA, they were getting that message from a lot of different folks. And but I think if I could be allowed a personal comment here, I really believe that in the world of aviation, we need to keep safety paramount, and that really is the safety is prime. We're always on some continuum of safety, privacy, security, but to me, federalism is a completely false premise in this particular regard. I'll say it from this perspective, and I'll spare anybody my story, but I have a story about being subject to something right after 9/11 and not having the information that I needed in order to be able to comply with it in flight at night, worried about getting shot down. If we're going to have every single mayor in the country be responsible for designing their own airspace, it begs the question of how do you as operators know what they want or what they're preventing? So if they're going to draw a polygon over a school, from 200 to 400 feet at a particular time in the afternoon or during the day, you need to know that that polygon exists and we need to be able to stay out of that polygon. What system are we using for you to be able to utilize to comply with that? And that question has to be answered first. I think the question of whether or not a local mayor or local authorities should be given something, perhaps under delegated authority from the FAA, some kind of authority to control what's happening over the airspace, is a perfectly legitimate argument and something that I think the IPP is designed to address, and hopefully will continue to move that conversation down the road. I just wish we could get away from concepts like federalism, which to me beg other questions about safety that I know this community can solve. I am absolutely certain this community will come up with systems that allow for people at the local level to do their jobs, and in concert with us as industry, you as operators, will keep that airspace safe.
And from the DJI perspective, certainly agree we need to figure out how to address the local and state issues, and particularly when it comes to privacy or nuisance. I actually think remote ID, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, plays into that. You can use existing state law if you can find the operator. So there's a way in which these things are actually solvable through technology and things that are already on that FAA integration path up on the screen. And I'm proud to say that when it comes to that Uniform Law Commission proposal, which would have basically created lawsuits against all of you every time you fly, possibly below 200 feet, the industry really stood up for your rights to fly and has worked on it. And the news emerging out of the Uniform Law Commission is that that proposal is being rethought from the beginning. So hopefully stay tuned for a better result than what we'd seen previously as a result of the advocacy that we're all doing for you. But I do want to ask the FAA on the Integration Pilot Program, which is designed to learn from state and local officials what might be needed or what the interests actually are. Where is that program? What's been accomplished? What's on the horizon?
The program is up and running. We are actively demonstrating a bunch of different concepts throughout the country, and they're vastly different. But to be clear, while we are working with the state and local governments, we're working with industry, it's more of a collaborative effort to see what the balancing act is between safety and these privacy concerns, local concerns. Less so a delegation of authority, and it never was meant to be that, and it's not that. So what it is we're gaining insight on what the local communities want, need, and are afraid of. I don't have any specifics to report in terms of how the local communities are responding to the programs in their area. The report is due on Thursday. So unfortunately, bad timing there. What I can say is that the program is active and it is diverse, like I said. We've got some operations testing medical deliveries, long line inspections in the Midwest, hog rebating, which is a rural area test to see, to protect crops and to use UAS in that manner. And we also had, of course, you've seen the delivery of the popsicle to the child in Virginia. So there's a diverse set of operations going out there, and we're gathering the data, which will help with our rulemaking activities and help with our waivers and help us get you guys out and flying, which is one of the benefits of the program.
Great, so let's talk about remote ID. If you were here at AirWorks a year ago, we had a similar panel, slightly different people. And we said remote ID, we just finished work on the Remote ID Aviation Rulemaking Committee. Some of us were on that. And we said that the next year, by the time we were here at AirWorks 2018, things would be moving forward and different, and we'd have a remote ID proposal or something. So here we are a year later. I'm gonna maybe go to Diana first about maybe just by background, the goals of remote ID, sort of what you see its role in the operator experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So almost 2 years ago, the former FAA Administrator, Michael Burnta, was supposed to announce at CES the proposed rule for flight over people, and it was halted in the last few days prior to the announcement by the security agencies. And so essentially their concern was, well, today if we see a drone operating over a crowd of people or a stadium, we know that's an illegal operation, and so we know that it's a threat. But how will we identify who's a friend versus a foe if we have a framework where lots of people can do these types of operations? And so that's really the background and the context for remote identification needs, and a lot of industry has participated in the rulemaking and the technologies that were put forward through AUVSI. And so, you know, the technology's there today, we're just waiting for the rule to drop, and we hear it's very imminent.
So, Danielle, where are we from an FAA perspective on remote ID?
It is a top priority at the FAA. We do have a rulemaking team that is actively working at rapid FAA speed. And in fact, it is a rapid speed by FAA standards. The team is on schedule to have an NPRM published in May of next year. So it's not quite where we would be. But what it is, I mean, it is meeting its intended goal to help balance those safety and security concerns that will pave the way for operations over people, which I know we're going to talk about, but we may see prior to remote ID.
Andrew, should commercial operators have any concerns about the costs or burdens or other aspects of remote ID that might be coming?
It's a little too early to tell, but I think the short answer is I wouldn't worry too much yet. I think a lot of the implementation costs will be in the vein of encouraging compliance. I think that the regulators are a little bit wary of imposing costs that aren't going to be able to be met. And so I think that for the time being, the end result is going to be that the FAA and regulators want to create a culture where it'll cost less to comply than it will to operate outside of the system.
And certainly at DJI, we agree with that. As many of you know, we've already deployed a form of remote ID called Aeroscope, and that's really been useful. We've seen in recent cases like the Albuquerque Balloon Festival, trying to identify what's in the air, going and talking to the pilots and saying, hey, this might not be a great place to fly, there's a TFR or other issue, and also learning from remote ID systems that exist today, what should the response be? You know, if you're an airport or a police department, do you need officers on bicycles to go and talk to the drone operators, or do we need to do more education or geofencing or something else? So we're glad we're already providing solutions to this real need, and certainly a way for the official solution, which I hope will be similar to Aeroscope in the sense that it doesn't cost anything for the community to comply. It's easy, it's automatic. There's sort of protection of privacy interests of your operations, in that the solution is basically local, like an electronic license plate. If you're flying somewhere, people can know sort of where you're standing and who you are. That makes a lot of sense to us. So really, I think over the next year, maybe by Airworks 2019, we'll have a more specific update on proposed rules. Also, when that proposal comes out, don't forget to comment. So the FAA's deliberate process is all about hearing from you as to things that might be concerning and helping FAA improve its rulemaking process before those rules go final. So when you see that NPRM in May or whenever it is, please file some comments and if they're doing a great job and they got it right, let them know that too. You don't just complain, we compliment.
Be nice every now and then.
Yeah, we do it all the time. So let's talk about LAANC and UTM, and I'll go back to Andrew. So Kitty Hawk and DJI were recently approved as LAANC service suppliers. Can you tell our enterprise operators what LAANC is, why it's useful, and what you see the future of it being?
Sure. So actually, I'd like to just ask a question to the audience real quick. How many of you have heard of LAANC and know what it is? That's very encouraging. So LAANC, just for a brief explanation, is the low altitude authorization and notification capability. And we're, at Kitty Hawk, we're really excited about the opportunities that LAANC will bring to our users. I mean, I think one of the stories that I enjoy telling about LAANC capabilities is, you know, imagine you're a commercial operator and you get asked by someone to go inspect a building that's a half a mile from the runway at SFO. Before LAANC, that was not an easy solution. You know, you would have had to go to the FAA. You would have had to go through their authorization process, which is a long process. It could take 90 days. And so I think a lot of commercial operators were understandably getting frustrated that they were losing out on opportunities to do that type of work. And I think the reason that LAANC is so exciting is it brings that 90-day process down to about 90 seconds. So in specific areas, for instance, parallel to a runway, there aren't a lot of planes operating in low altitude in that area. So it's a much lower risk environment. And so I think that LAANC is exciting because it addresses the appropriate risk level of operating in certain environments. And I think the most exciting part is that you know, our users have come to us and said that they will be able to do more operations with more certainty, and that really is the name of the game that our users, and I think most commercial users, want out of that system.
So Brian, LAANC I've heard described as sort of the first step towards unmanned traffic management, also known as UTM. Can you give us a sense of what's in the FAA bill on UTM, where you think the research and development, and at some point, if you look at the slide, the rulemaking will line up, and sort of how would UTM provide additional capabilities to our enterprise customers?
Yeah, well, first off, it is and it isn't. I mean, in some ways, it is a first step. Danielle mentioned the need to automate things. This is a step that we needed to get that process started. And I think if we think back in dog years of decades ago when we were still doing Section 333 exemptions, those started out as taking months and months and months, and then pretty soon they were doing block grants, and then they were almost automated once everybody figured out, okay, this is the way you do it. Hopefully we've got rules codified for nighttime operations, et cetera. So yes, I think it is kind of the first step in automating. If we look at concept of operations for UTM that's been developed, the ability to do these things, and it goes back to what I was talking about before about everyone having access to it without being a TRACON designer, having access to the tools that are needed in order to draw polygons in space and do that dynamically so the drones can operate autonomously through the airspace and do deliveries and things like that. We've got a whole bunch of hoops to jump through to get from here to there. I think what was in the FAA Reauthorization Bill was important because there continues to be a need, I suspect, to make sure that everyone inside the FAA knows that it's everybody's job to deal with unmanned systems. There's hardly anybody that's not touched by that. And if we think about unmanned systems as just the next step on a continuum of automation that goes all the way up to cargo jets and someday, things that we fly in ourselves, then yes, we all need to be thinking about how do these things operate in parallel? What step follows the next step? How do we build confidence in automation so that over time things can get to where we know technology will take them? So it's important to have that direction in the FAA Reauthorization Bill from Congress to say we want you moving toward UTM, doing what it needs to be done. Nothing can be done inside the regulatory process without data. So in many respects, all of the different things that we're doing can provide the data sets that we need to keep building toward that where the puck is arguably going, which is autonomy.
Danielle, what's the FAA's perspective on UTM and how might it interact with the milestones on that slide?
I agree with everything Brian said. And what I think is important to remember is that the FAA is collaborating with the industry to do this. There's no one agency or one entity that's doing this. And LAANC is an example of that, is using the service providers to build the system and to enable the system. And that's the future of where we're going. And that's part of the automation, that's part of getting there more quickly, and it's part of the data exchanges that we all need to get the job done. I think that, like I said earlier, we do have this line from low risk to full integration. It doesn't really stop there. I don't know that passenger operations defines what full integration is. Right now, we're kind of dabbling in all of these things and they all come together. Remote ID is not going to solve all of our problems, it will solve some. LAANC solved a lot of the problems, but as we get more aggressive in what we're doing and more capabilities and being more creative with what we can do now, I think we'll see this line maybe move a little bit more staggered in a good way, getting toward a common goal.
Jazz, do you see the remote ID and LAANC being connected to a part of the drone mitigation counter UAS solutions? What's the relationship there?
Well, absolutely. We've been working closely with the folks from DoD, and I think their first concern is just understanding whose aircraft it is, and then the second thing that not a lot of people talk about, but who's flying it. So, in case somebody takes somebody else's drone and does something bad with it, they want to know the match. So think about cars, your car license plate and your driver's license. So I think this is heading in the right direction.
Perfect. Show of hands, how many of you in the audience have a Part 107 night operational waiver? Great, maybe about half or so. How about, what do you think, do you see value in flight over people for your business? How many of you think there's significant value in that? Great, if I could ask Danielle for an update, where are we on sort of waivers for those and maybe other types of operations beyond Part 107? And then also, at what point will we see a rule for night ops and flight over people?
Does anybody have an ops over people waiver? One of the 20, congratulations.
The back.
Yeah, so ops over people, so a few statistics. We've got 20 ops over people waivers out there now out of over 3,700 requests. Night, we're doing a little bit better, number-wise, not necessarily statistically. We've got 2,000 night waivers out of over 9,000 requests. So our percentages are improving. We've taken a lot of steps to help the waiver process go better for you. We had the waiver webinar series over the summer that kind of walked through the individual parts of 107 that are waivable. And we published the waiver safety explanation guidelines to help explain when we say, bring us your safety case, not your business case, what that means. A lot of people don't really know what that means, so we're trying to help you. Our job is not consultants, it's to help you get us what we need to help you. Ops over people, we've talked about this a few times, is actively in federal final coordination. We should see an NPRM soon that will include provisions for night as well. Now, while it's a notice of proposed rulemaking and not a final rule, there's still value there for you guys in a number of ways. One, you get to comment on it and we need your feedback. Two, you can kind of get some insight on what the FAA is thinking and where it's going. So you can start preparing for it and start filling out your waiver requests accordingly. And when we get there, when we get to better waiver applications, even in advance of the rule, it frees up resources on our end and enables you guys to get up there flying more quickly. So there is some value in the NPRM, although it is frustrating. The rulemaking process takes very long. I would say that the ops over people rule is imminent, as far as I know.
That's great to hear. You may have heard we released a drone with a strobe light on it, so hopefully we're anticipating that there will be
3-mile visibility light.
Coincidentally, 3-mile visibility. You may recognize that number. So certainly we're looking forward to a future where people can routinely do night operations and clearly will save lives. We're already up to 196 lives saved, people rescued using drones around the world. So if we get more of those operations happening, we really think the benefit will be even more than it is today. But from an operational perspective, Diana, what do you see benefit to ops over people, night operations, and beyond?
Absolutely. So our company holds night operations as well as the online site waiver. We'll look forward to operations over people in the future. From our perspective, there's a lot of missions that we fly during the day that are just as beneficial and sometimes safer to conduct at night. If you want to do a bridge inspection, there's less cars on the road. Makes for a better experience in terms of conducting safely. So a lot of the same applications in agriculture, energy, infrastructure will benefit from the ability to fly at night. Similarly with flight over people, it opens up a lot of urban applications and helps us move towards the future of package delivery, UTM, and other exciting things.
Great, and certainly like all other rulemaking, when you see that notice of proposed rulemaking, we'll probably have about 60 days to file your comments. And for flight over people, I anticipate there will be a parachute requirement for drones of a certain size. And so that means costs and burdens and product choices that you may or may not like. Certainly get engaged when you see that proposal come out imminently and make your voice heard. Obviously, we'll be doing our best as your industry advocates to keep those burdens and costs as low as possible so you can go out and do all the great things that you're already doing. Let's talk about critical infrastructure. I think this cuts across really all the things we've talked about. The need to protect critical facilities from inadvertent or potentially harmful UAS operations. In the short-term extension that was a prelude to the FAA Bill in 2016, Congress created what's called Section 2209, directing the FAA to create a process so that facility owners could apply for a flight restriction of some kind. So basically, if you own a power plant or if you're a state government that has a dam facility, you can go to the FAA and say, hey, we're worried about drones, we need some kind of assurance here. Brian, can you tell us sort of how that might address some of the concerns that we've heard and where things stand? And is there anything in the new bill that moves us forward on that?
I understand in the new bill that there's one more thing for the FAA to do, which is to kind of narrow this down. It's a critical infrastructure. This is fixed infrastructure. In other words, they're obviously a baseball game, might move around in Boston, LA. So, but nuclear power plants generally don't move around, not yet anyway. And there have been some instances where anecdotally, police have rolled up to the fence and said, hey, we're looking for the guy that's flying around your cooling tower, only to be told that's our operation. So I think it's quite interesting that, it comes back to who's flying that drone, is it an authorized operation, and currently nobody really necessarily, law enforcement don't really have the ability to tell one from another. So, but this is a tough one where we've got to find a balance. And on the one hand, we understand that we don't want anybody flying over an open pond of former cooling rods, right? There's inherent risks in certain areas where you're not going to want anybody flying. So being able to not only designate those areas, but also potentially be able to mitigate if someone flew over those areas and wasn't authorized to do so. This is in everyone's interest. But by the same token, we don't want it so broad that quite literally anybody could come forward with a case and say, this isn't moving, and we think it's critical infrastructure, and now we've got a whole bunch of people in a lawsuit. So that's the idea here, is to try and get that narrowed down, and once again have that process move with a little bit more speed than I think typically has been the case.
Jazz, why not just equip them all with counter UAS measures and be done with it? Isn't that the answer here?
That'd be great for business.
You're welcome.
I don't think that's basically. I don't think that that's the answer, though, because I think the issue is some facilities are super sensitive. If they do want to take a nuclear facility or some sort of a military facility, yeah, you want to be able to take things out right away. But I think that, again, coming back to the access control idea, which is you're going to first want to know what's coming and going in your airspace, and then that consists of detection and ID. And so those are the first two priorities that these facilities have. We've seen it even from our customers. They first want to do that because a lot of them want to use drones. And so if you think about dangerous jobs at these critical facilities, like inspecting a smokestack or all the crazy things that people propel off of helicopters, it's crazy nuts to do those jobs. But you look at those dangerous jobs that are replaced by drones, they don't want the drones usually on their facility because they don't know how to verify it's theirs or somebody else's. And so I think detection and ID is going to be the first thing, and then you'll see mitigation once they feel a little safer with it.
Andrew, what's the role of software solutions in this balance between principal flight locations, sensitive infrastructure, software playing a role?
I think there's a big role for software applications, especially from an education perspective. I think half the battle is having the knowledge of where it's acceptable and where it's going to be a challenge. So I think getting that information into people's hands so that they can make more educated and informed operational decisions is absolutely an important way forward.
Great. Let's talk for a few minutes about model aircraft. I think that, as you recognize, was one of the most significant outcomes in the bill, is the change to the framework for operations for non-commercial purposes. And personally speaking, I think that's the feeder for all of you, for people who are interested in drone technology, and end up becoming your pilots or your entrepreneurs who work with you. So just actually stay with Andrew for a second. Can you tell us what changes occurred in this bill with respect to the model aircraft framework?
Sure. So, there were a number of changes in the model aircraft regime, but I think two of the most important ones are, one, the knowledge test for hobbyist operators, and also essentially anyone that wants to operate in controlled airspace, whether they're a hobbyist or a Part 107 operator, they're going to need to be authorized. And so I think those are two of the main important things that came out on the hobbyist side of the FAA reauthorization. And I think it's important to keep the hobbyists in mind, especially because I think a lot of commercial operators they get their start as a hobbyist, and I think that there's a lot of value in enabling the hobbyists to continue. And I think there's also the growing realization that we all essentially share the same national airspace system, and so there needs to be a place for them as well.
Yes, does this help address security concerns? What do you think of hobbyist operators?
So I get to wear two hats, right? And beyond the counter UAS stuff, I'm a modeler. I've got 85 from helicopters to planes to you name it. It's a really fun part of learning the hobby. So I've got the hat of being a modeler. On the other side, I'm on the drone advisory committee with the FAA, so I look at the regulatory side of it too. I think what it comes down to is priorities. When you look at what's happening in theater, we're working directly with a lot of the military folks. In theater, what's happening is that troops are being attacked by two types of systems, drones and also fixed-wing model aircraft. So I think you think about these model aircraft can also be used in dangerous ways. So if a drone that can fly and cause interference in an airplane, the same can be done with a model aircraft. So I think everyone has to have those same rules of identity.
Diana, you were involved, I believe, in some of the proposals out there to make these changes. What's your sense of what a reasonable outcome is? Did Congress get it right?
I don't think Congress got it, got the optimal mix of the right balance in terms of, ensuring compliance and promoting compliance with the system. I think it's slightly heavy-handed because it does really open up the entire modeler and recreational community to the full spectrum of regulations in the future. I do think it's important that we get all operators into the remote ID framework and some critical components, but we did advocate for and successfully got a couple of measures in there, like to ensure that there's online testing available. You're like, a teenager that just got your drone, probably not going to get that as a gift or want to go out and fly it if you have to go to an FAA test center and do a really intensive test on navigational charts and things like that. That just, that's not what the hobby is about. There are better ways to educate hobbyists and recreational users, and so that's one of the safety measures that we successfully champion along with DJI and many others.
Danielle, what are the next steps on the FAA side for implementing the new model aircraft framework?
So the FAA rapidly formed an implementation team for the new rules. As Diana said, the rules are specific in some areas, but leave some open areas in others. So the first thing will be to look at how we're going to change the airspace authorization process to make it the same for everyone, or at least similar. But there's room in the bill for us to work with the agencies. We have a long-standing relationship with AMA and other community-based organizations. And we'll continue to work with them in industry on the development of the policies on the test and the safety guidelines and the aircraft certification piece for the larger aircraft. So there's plenty of opportunity in there for us to collaborate with the industry. And in addition, part of the reauthorization allocated some funds for the No Before Fly campaign, which kind of plays into this whole idea of working together. And the FAA does spend a lot of our resources on education and outreach with hopes that the more we reach what's now basically the general public, the less we'll need to lean on counter UAS measures and more stringent regulatory frameworks for model aircraft operators as well as everyone else.
So if you get it right, Jazz is out of business.
No, but I think we agree that it should be a last resort, hopefully.
Got it, great.
Need a vacation, I'll take the vacation.
I got to jump in here. You know how weird this conversation is? If you think about it, we've been talking up here for I don't know how long now, for all the regulations that we need from the regulator in order to enable extended operations. And here we get around to, well, these guys succeeded 336. They were not subject to regulation, right? And so, in some ways, somebody who's been in Washington for a long time, most of the time when you're lobbying in Washington, you're trying to get out from under regulation, right? And yet, because of the business that we're in, and AUVSI goes across domains, but we're talking about air domain today, we have to have permission to get access to the airspace. And there's a tension in that. As a general aviation pilot, how many general aviation pilots? Right? We talk about the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, our freedom to fly. Well, it's not really freedom, is it? Right? We've got to work really hard to get permission, to get the privileges. We don't want those privileges removed, but the FAA can remove those privileges. Right? So this is, I go back to this is kind of the maturing of this effort that we need the regulation to kind of fit what the flying is. and this is particularly difficult. I think we got down a wrong path when, and we have a great relationship with AMA, right, through Know Before You Fly. We talked a lot, Rich and I talked a lot about how to make this work. It's never going to be perfect when Congress gets involved. But at the end of the day, it's, you know, it really is, I think, part of the maturity of this industry that we're figuring out how to get the regulations in a way that they're enabling us to get done what needs to be done with no more regulation than necessary. And I think at some point we will be talking about, you know, at one point there was a micro rule out there, remember that? Anything under two pounds, et cetera, et cetera. I think as the data sets get better and as the community gets better and we embrace this idea that we have to respect our privileges and the privileges of others and follow rules, I think we'll see a deregulatory effort. That's not a risk. We can deregulate that. And I'm hoping I'm around long enough to see that happen.
Thank you, great perspective. So we left a few minutes for maybe a couple questions. While the microphones go around, I'm just gonna put up Danielle's next slide, indicating ways in which the FAA can help support your operations, particularly in the public safety area. Would you like to say a bit about that?
Yes, I mean, there's a lot of information out there. It's not always presented in the easiest possible way to find. So there's a couple links here. The first two are for, the first one is for the drone zone, and that's where I'm sure you guys are familiar with registration and waivers. The waiver webinar series there, like I said earlier, was an effort over the summer. I think it was like a 9-part series that touches all the different waiverable parts of 107. So you can go back and watch those videos. And I will say now that we're launching a second series of webinars in January that will address all airspace issues, everything from identification of airspace to LAANC and how to get authorization. If you have questions about public aircraft operations, which is probably the most misunderstood regulatory framework, there are some resources there for you.
Great, thank you. We've got a microphone right there in the aisle. Maybe we'll take the person right next to it.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
My name is Ivan Lopez. My question is the as an aircraft technician, pilot, SUAS operator, do we foresee aircraft maintenance applications going to incorporate drones at some point in time?
Well, I'll answer first. We did a great demo yesterday with American Airlines here at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport using our new Mavic 2 Enterprise for inspection. Would we think of a different application or that?
The rules that apply to general aviation and formal aircraft, are those rules at some point going to bleed over into maintaining your drones?
Maintenance. Okay, I'll let the FAA handle that. And then
Airworthiness requirements. As you know, Part 107, there are no airworthiness requirements, so there are no specific maintenance requirements to go along with that. I think as we move towards Part 135 operations and airworthiness certificates and type certificates for drones, we may see some related maintenance. But
I think, gentlemen in the middle, go ahead.
Good afternoon. My name is Ernest Huffman. I'm with North Central Texas Council of Governments. And just last week, we started a task force to help our region successfully, safely integrate UAS technology in the Metroplex. What are some of the things we could do as a region to help with the UAS integration pipeline?
Who would like to take that?
Sure, I'll start. It's great that you're getting engaged and that you set up a task force, and it sounds like you're looking to promote the use of drones in your community as opposed to create additional restrictions. So already that's amazing. I love you. I hope there are more of you out there. One of the most important things I think is really getting education out across the users about what the federal rules are and how to be a good sort of corporate citizen within that federal framework. Helping do matchmaking, create partnerships, getting engaged, with all the different players and stakeholders, and I think that's sort of the best thing you can do to promote your local industry.
Great, and final question, Colin?
Yeah, Colin Snow, Skylogic Research. On the previous slide, can you put up the previous slide that was the UAS integration?
There we go.
I've seen this slide in several iterations, and I appreciate that you do this. My question is, I didn't see on this slide anything specific to beyond visual line of sight operations. Is that going to just stay as it is under Part 107 operations, or one of those other heavily worded things?
I think it kind of weaves into a lot of. Did you have something to say?
So we're heavily invested, as most of you know, in beyond visual line of sight. So from our understanding, this is going to be caught into the expanded operations framework. And we've already wrapped, 2 pathfinders in this area and have provided good data alongside our partner BNSF. So we're looking forward to that moving forward as well.
I would concur.
Well, thank you everyone on the panel and for all of you for attending. Number one point here, get engaged. All this stuff is somewhat complex, but really will govern the scope of the things you're able to do, the size of your business, where you can operate, how you can operate. So please keep in touch with all of us who are your advocates of government, and thank you again.